Hello. In this lecture, we're going to consider one of the principal utilitarians and how he went about thinking about morality and utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham. Bentham, let's see his years again, 1748 to 1832. He's one of the heroes of the Enlightenment. He was a genius, verifiable. He's playing the violin by the time he was 4, speaking Latin by the same time. By the time he was 16, he'd gotten a law degree from Oxford. He invented words, and the frigidarium is his idea of the refrigerator. The conversation tube, this was something like in Jules Verne stories for communicating between decks of a ship. Circumgyration, he may have been the world's first jogger, not runner, but jogger. He made contributions to any number of areas. He wrote a model legal code that included provisions for the rights of animals. And we might wonder, for the first time, so why? Well, the standard of utility for Bentham was pleasure. Animals can experience pleasure and pain. Therefore, since they are the loci for pleasure and pain, we should consider them. He designed a model prison. Prisons were real hellholes in the 18th century, and he designed one that was supposedly humane. It minimized the number of guards you need. It was cylindrical. So all the guards could be in the hub, and they could surveil all the inmates without being seen themselves. So the inmates never knew when they were being surveilled. This impressed the French 20th century philosopher Michel Foucault highly, and he used it in his own political philosophy. He was, as many geniuses are, Bentham was eccentric. He, as we said, he liked to invent words, and he gave names to things like his tea kettle, his walking stick, his cat was the Reverend Mr. something or other. He, talk about eccentric. Take a look when you wish. You want to stop this and do a Google search on Bentham and autoicon, AUTO-ICON. It's shocking what you'll see. Bentham knew that utilitarianism was extremely demanding. The problem is, how are you going to inspire people to be good utilitarians? Well, we're inspired by heroes. Bentham thought this would be himself. So he, in his provision of his will, he said as a condition of giving his bequest to University College London, his alma mater, he wanted to be there at the Board of Trustee meetings in perpetuity. So on some anniversary of Bentham's, it must have been a birthday, they had a birthday party for him at the University of Texas, Austin, and they had a video hookup with Bentham's residence in London, University College London, where he still resides. With respect to his will, he, as a part of the will, he wanted to have himself preserved, stuffed. And he had his friend, who was a physician, agree to do this when he died. Bentham was to be publicly dissected for the edification of the public and their education. And then he would be preserved. And when you take a look, you'll see images of him, photographs of a nice, something like oak box, like what used to be a telephone booth. Jeremy Bentham over the top, and there he is. He sits in there behind a glass door on a chair with a little table next to him with his gloves and his spectacles, and his walking stick is there with him, and he's sitting there with his broad-brimmed hat. You can find images of him at a party. They had a retirement party for some dean, I guess, in a lab. And there's Bentham sitting there. Everyone's sitting around with a plastic cup of wine or something, and Bentham's sitting there too. There is Bentham was, he'd always wanted to go to America. 2 years ago, he made it. They sent Bentham, or what's left of him, to be placed on view in a museum in New York. I can't think of anything more terrifying than this, that somebody using himself as an object, his body, as a means of propagating his views. But that tells us something of the kind of guy that Bentham was. If you look closely in some of the pictures, you'll see a mummified head between his feet. That's his real head. Chemistry, taxidermy being what it was, and in the 19th century, he promptly fell apart. So they gave him a nice wax head, and his skeleton is inside his clothes, and there's his head. So that's Bentham. Now, Bentham, in his principal work on ethics, the principles of morals and legislation, spends a couple chapters on just really elucidating the nature of pleasure and pain and enumerating them. He has to do this. Any utilitarian, as we said, what makes an action right or wrong is the world. You have to be able to get it right. So he goes to great lengths at describing various kinds of pleasures and pains. Because if you're going to be a utilitarian, you have to go out and identify these. Let's think about this. We said that there must be one standard of utility in terms of which anything that has value can be measured. One standard. J.J.C. Smart, the utilitarian, contemporary utilitarian philosopher, does a nice job of considering this. Let's take a moment to look at this. He's considering this problem, that there be one standard. And he's considering the difference between hedonistic utilitarians like Bentham, who believes that pleasure is the standard of utility, and what we might call eudaimonistic or utilitarians like Mill, who thought that happiness is the appropriate standard of utility. So Smart says, poetry elevates the mind, makes one more sensitive, and so harmonizes with various intellectual pursuits, some of which are of practical value. Delight in mathematics is even more obviously on Benthamite views, a pleasure worth encouraging, for on the progress of mathematics depends the progress of mankind. Even the most hedonistic schoolmaster would prefer to see his boys enjoying poetry and mathematics, rather than neglecting these arts for the pleasures of marbles or the tuck shop. Tuck shop is a British term, I guess, for what we'd call convenience store or candy store. Indeed, many of the brutish pleasures not only lack fecundity, but are actually the reverse of fecund. To enjoy food too much is to end up fat, unhealthy, and without zest or vigor. To enjoy drink too much is even worse. In most circumstances of ordinary life, the pure hedonist will agree in his practical recommendations with the quasi-ideal utilitarian. This need not always be so. Some years ago, two psychologists, Olds and Milner, carried out some experiments with rats. Through the skull of each, this is the early 1960s, through the skull of each rat, they inserted an electrode. These electrodes penetrated to various regions of the brain. In the case of some of these regions, the rat showed behavior characteristics of pleasure when a current was passed from the electrode. In others, they seemed to show pain, and in others, the stimulus seemed neutral. That a stimulus was pleasure-giving was shown by the fact that the rat would learn to pass the current himself by pressing a lever. He would neglect food and make straight for this lever and start stimulating himself. In some cases, he would sit there pressing the lever every few seconds for hours on end. This calls up a pleasant picture of the voluptuary of the future. Bald-headed man with a number of electrodes protruding from his skull, one to give the physical pleasure of sex, one for that of eating, one of that for that of drinking, and so on. Now, is this the sort of life that all our ethical planning should culminate in? A few hours work a week, automatic factories, comfort and security from disease, and hours spent at a switch, continually electrifying various regions of one's brain? Surely not. Men were made for higher things, one can't help wanting to say, even though one knows that men weren't made for anything, but are the products of evolution by natural selection. It might be said that the objection to continual sensual stimulation of the above sort is that, all right, so this is going to interfere with feelings of romantic love and so on. But this is a thought experiment, so we can get around that. And he says, and he does. So suppose, however, that the facts turned out otherwise. He doesn't get lazy and so on. But man could and would do his full share of work in the office or factory and come back in the evening to a few hours contented electrode work without bad after effects. This would be his greatest pleasure, and the pleasure would be so great intrinsically and so easily repeatable that its lack of fecundity would not matter. Indeed, perhaps by this time, human arts such as medicine, engineering, agriculture, and architecture will have been brought to a pitch of perfection sufficient to enable most of the human race to spend most of its time electrode operating without compensating pains of starvation, disease, and squalor. Would this be a satisfactory state of society? Would this be the millennium towards which we've been striving? Surely the pure hedonist would have to say that it was, and he would. Since if this is your standard of utility is pleasure, this is very efficient for producing it. Sounds ridiculous. Such a life sounds ridiculous. Well, that's the problem of finding a single standard of value that's supposed to capture all kinds of value. So we'll return to that when we look at some of the problems. So, this one. All right, briefly, how does Bentham go about it? What are we trying to do? Utility is value. We're trying to maximize utility, and utility being pleasure for Bentham. So value, utility is value. There are two kinds of value, intrinsic and instrumental. Intrinsic value, or is what's good in itself. He called this states of affairs. So states of affairs are just pieces of the world with pleasure in them and pain. And then the other category of value is instrumental value. What has instrumental value? Actions. Actions are valuable insofar as they get us good states of affairs. And then he turns to each of these, because what we're doing is we need to go out in the world and measure the utility that different actions would produce. He's trying to give us some guidance into how we do this. So he turns then to states of affairs. There are four characteristics of states of affairs. Intensity. This would be magnitude, basically. How much good or bad exists for each affected person. We can equate it with dollar value, which is the greater the financial value of an asset, the more intense the good, the larger the cost of a liability, the more intense the bad. Second, duration. Duration is how long the state of affairs lasts. An example would be the depreciation of some machinery, equipment. Or let's say we have a baseball scout looking for a shortstop, and he finds two players of equal talent, but different ages. So all else being equal, the older player will be of less value presumably, because his career would be shorter. We mentioned the 20,000 year half-life of plutonium. That's a duration consideration. Propinquity, or this is nearness in time to it. So the interval, how near to the present are the various good or bad results that the action will produce? How long is the interval between the present and the good or bad that comes about? This is I need a new example, but this, we go back to the bad days of AIDS, say the late 80s. Somebody who would be diagnosed at that time as HIV positive would naturally have the question of how long would it be before a full-blown case of AIDS would develop? Because in those days, there was nothing that could be done whatsoever. So how long before I get AIDS? I've been diagnosed as being HIV positive. When will I get sick? That resonates with us now, of course. Notice that how different this is, though, from the question of duration. Duration is how long will the state of affairs last. Propinquity is how long before it gets here. A person at that time who would develop a case of AIDS would naturally wonder, because nothing could be done, how long would they have to live? That's a duration question. When does it get here is a propinquity question. Propinquity is somewhat controversial. A lot of philosophers have thought that propinquity is irrelevant. It doesn't matter when it gets here, it matters how much there is. So once we account for time-related factors, so if we're looking at finances, inflation, once we've accounted for that, then it shouldn't matter when it gets here. We'll return to that later, because that's one of the psychological problems of utilitarianism. And last, the characteristic is extent. That is, how many persons are affected one way or another, and to what degree by the action. So that's states of affairs, their characteristics. When he turns to actions, there are three characteristics of actions that he finds to be relevant: purity, fecundity, and certainty. Remember in Smart's discussion, he mentioned fecundity. Purity is the extent to which we get what we want without getting bad side effects. Remember, so purity is points to the distinction between direct and oblique intention. Remember, that was Bentham's intention, and this is what it's about. This an action is a physical event in one dimension. Of course, we said actions also involve intention, but yes, they also involve the physics of the action in the world. Actions have all kinds of effects, most of which we're not aware of, as we said. But they're relevant. It's just we obliquely intend the side effects of our actions of which we're aware. We must take those into account. Here's an example of purity. Years ago, the United States banned a method of tuna fishing that involved laying nets in, porpoises. Porpoises eat tuna. So if you can find out where the porpoises are heading, if a whole pod of porpoises are going in a particular direction, there's a good chance that they're chasing some tuna. So if you have a fleet of tuna boats, and one can radio others whether there's some porpoises heading in this bearing, lay your nets out here, several miles out, the porpoises will drive the tuna right into your nets. Very effective. Unfortunately, porpoises, being mammals, drown when they were caught in nets also. So the U.S. banned this. It used to be years ago. I just looked today, that no longer on the can, but you used to find on a can of tuna, porpoise free, meaning not that there's no porpoise in the can, but that porpoises weren't killed in the production of the tuna. All right, let's say that the ban is in effect. Let's say there's a $10,000 fine for violating the ban and an $800 increase in profits for violating. You have a 5% chance of being caught. In 20 runs, you have a gain of $16,000. This assumes being caught and having to pay the fine once in 20 trips. The fine is the impurity. So subtract the impurity, the fine, from the gross gain, $16,000, and we have what, $6,000 net balance. Sorry for the pun. This points to the necessity of considering the greatest net good rather than the greatest total good. Part of the value of utilitarianism is that it focuses attention on these various dimensions of action. That's one of its greatest values, I think. We mentioned that sometimes all the alternatives, all of our options, will lead to results that come out under zero. Think of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster back in the 80s, meltdown in the Ukraine of nuclear reactor. The political leaders in charge knew that unless they sent people in to contain the reaction, it'd be a disaster. They knew that the people that they were sending in would die of radiation poisoning. But they also knew that if they didn't contain the reaction, far more people would die. That's a bad situation to be in, certainly for the people, the genuine heroes who went in to contain the reaction, but also having to send people to their death. If you're utilitarian, you have no choice. That's what you have to do. Because our job is to maximize utility. And sometimes that means minimizing disutility. It's a more accurate description of the situation. Second, fecundity. Smart didn't mention this. Fecundity is an interesting property of some actions, that they become more productive the more they are done, the more they're performed. So, for example, it's not limited to this, but actions that become more productive with practice would be fecund actions. So working on your golf swing or your jump shot or practicing the piano are fecund actions. Eating pistachio nuts is not. It's nice, but it doesn't get better the more you do it. We can understand ignorance to be the limitation of the assessment of fecundity. And last is certainty, that the utilitarian has a discounting factor here. So this is very important because an action will be more desirable among the options the more certain its consequences are. To the extent that its consequences are not certain, or are less certain, we can give them less weight. So that would be one way of approaching the plutonium problem, presumably. In the Timmins anthology, that's one of the two books we have in the course. There's a piece by Bentham. At the end of that, he gives his outline of the calculation procedure. I believe it has 6 steps. We reduced it to 3. It's pretty much the same. But that, in a nutshell, is how one serious utilitarian approaches how we need to look at the world in terms of utilitarianism and making moral decisions.